On the Chinese, the last 20 years of my life, from about 60 to 80, have been dominated in some ways by China. I didn't expect this. It's a bonus in my later life, and it happened, as all these things do, accidentally. A friend of mine, a very close friend, Jerry Martin, suggested in 1996 that that's his wife and my wife, visit China as tourists, travel around, because he'd set up businesses in Hong Kong and Singapore and so on, but never been to the mainland, and it was just becoming possible to do that. So we went for 10 days, usual tourist tour around the Great Wall and Xi'an and Guilin and so on, and were astonished and delighted. It was like Columbus suddenly finding new oceans and new seas, a whole extraordinary world which I'd spent my whole life not really being aware of. Of course, I knew China was there, but I thought the images we had in the West were based largely on either the terrible battles of the past, the Opium Wars and so on, or the terrible times of Chairman Mao and at the end events in China which we disapproved of. So I expected something grey and dull and whatever. I'm not sure what I expected, but the reality was very different. From the moment we stepped off the plane in a very antiquated airport, which was just being rebuilt using wheelbarrows and picks and shovels, that was 1996, to the time we left from Hong Kong. We saw, as they often say in the metaphor, a dragon shaking itself and awaking. Jerry, particularly as an industrialist, said, "Watch this. This is the most extraordinary event in terms of economic and industrial social history unfolding in front of our eyes. It's just beginning. And China will become the great power in a generation or two." He saw this. I didn't see it as clearly. But we loved the visit, so I then started running seminars and reading about China and becoming really interested in it. And then in 2002, we were invited by Professor James Lee to join his expedition to the northern province of Liaoning to look at the work they were doing on the demography of China by looking at graves and census registers for the northern area where the Qing government had kept its troops, and in order to keep the balance there, they had kept quite detailed records. So we were accompanying this expedition, which had very good contacts, so we went in at the highest levels and had meals with governors and deputy governors and mayors, and then went down to local villages and saw how local politics worked and local government. And it was still quite a poor area there, though the big cities of Shenyang and others were growing. But we could see it had changed, and Beijing had changed enormously in those 6 years. The new airport was there, and there were goods in the shops of a new kind. And that sparked our interest even further. And fortunately, I got my first Chinese PhD students, of whom I had 4 or 5 in my last years, and they became close friends and incredibly important, because the kind of anthropology I was able to do in China was depended on these friendships with younger students. I would go with one of them around China, visiting their family networks and their personal networks, go to universities, give talks. And so I could get right away from the tourist bubble and from the big hotels and the big cities into quite remote areas. Our second trip, we went up the not quite flooded Yangtze, and we went to remote areas of Yunnan and Sichuan. And from then on, I was hooked on China, as was my wife. The immense diversity of the place, from areas like Greenland and Finland in their ecology and climate, down to really tropical south, from the great cities and excitement of the east to the beautiful countryside and old agricultural field of the west in Sichuan, Yunnan, Guangzhou and so on. And each year we took a different route. So we systematically explored 3 quarters. I mean, the quarter we didn't go to was the northwest in Gansu and Xinjiang, but more or less all the rest of China I've been to, and a number of places a number of times, both countryside and cities. And I had a particular interest in the southwest because my grandfather learnt Yunnanese and mapped the border between Burma and China 100 years ago. So Yunnan, which is a very beautiful area of China with beautiful flowers and mountains and a very good climate, became one of our favourites. And I became a visiting professor for 5 years at Sichuan University, and a visiting professor for a while at Peking and Tsinghua universities and others. So all the time I was travelling, filming. I took a video camera from the second visit, and I've got hundreds of hours of film all over China, photographing, Sarah keeping detailed diaries. So we've got an account of how China changed in those crucial years, 20 years, when it turned from a fairly middling level economy and society to a modern one. And all the time I was trying to write, I wrote articles, I gave talks, in a comparative way. I now had a comparison between Nepal, one kind of society, Japan another, England of course another, and China. And all the time I was wondering how China fitted in. China, of course, is ancient. It's the most ancient preserved civilization on earth. It's the only one that dates back to before the birth of Christ in its continuous development. So far more ancient than any other. It's the largest, both in number of people and in land area, and it's one of the most diverse. Although the Han are 90% of the population, there are 100 million ethnic minority peoples split into many groups, and they've preserved a lot of their way of life. So it's enormously diverse. Its languages are diverse, even within districts and regions. There's great dialect differences, and there are differences between, obviously, Mandarin and Cantonese and so on, and vast differences between the cities and the countryside. So it's very difficult to encompass, and I found as I tried to write my articles and books, I was searching around for some way to approach this great civilization. There are shelves of books on China in front of me, and every way I thought of had already been either done by someone or it was beyond my powers, because I don't read Chinese and I'm not an expert. So how could I contribute at all, and how could I understand it? Because one of the features of the books, which some of which I've read, was that none of them was entirely satisfactory. There was no single book that I could point to and say, well, if you read that and 2 or 3 others, you will understand China. I asked some of my leading Chinese professor friends if they could recommend books, and I'd read them, like Tawney's Land and Labour or Fei Xiaotong's works or whatever, and they were useful, but they didn't really tell you what China was or was like. There was no key to China. And the anthropologists had done very good work, but they were, if you wanted to know about life in one particular part of China at a particular point in time, you read their monographs, but they didn't generalize over China, and attempts to generalize over China were rather superficial and unsatisfactory. So I was faced with a dilemma. How could I contribute and understand it for myself? So I approached it, in fact, increasingly in two ways. After struggling with it for 15 years or so, I decided that to write a overview, either by time, would end up with 10 volumes of the Cambridge history of China, or splitting it up by area would be again a huge job. Themes didn't seem to quite work either. You could write whole books on Chinese economics or society or whatever. So I'd already written a book about understanding the English A to Z, where I took the letters of the alphabet and I wrote short kind of Wikipedia articles on different aspects, games or pubs or whatever it was. And so I tried doing this with China. So I wrote a book called Understanding the Chinese, a Personal A to Z, where I took many subjects, lots of them I didn't know much about until I did a little more research, but things like food or canals or Tibet or Guangxi or whatever it is, and just wrote a page or two about them. I found it educated me, and it's been translated into Chinese, and I checked it obviously with my close Chinese friends and colleagues, and they corrected a few things, but on the whole, keeping it to that level of explaining Chinese culture and civilization through a kind of jigsaw puzzle, just little parts here. And the idea is that if you put all the bits together, you get a better idea. And it was introduced with chapters about the miraculous economic miracle of China, and possibly why it had happened, and also about how difficult China is to understand for a Westerner, because we look at it through so many prejudices. There are two chapters on this. The 19th century prejudices, the way in which an earlier huge admiration for China in the 18th century had, after about 1830, become a racist, prejudiced view that the Chinese were backward, inferior, dirty, untrustworthy, and so on. The devastating effects of the two Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, the Warlord period, and so on, in shaping Western imagination so that we are highly prejudiced towards China. And I say we are because one of the things, talking to my friends, my family, looking at the media like the BBC and so on, they are totally distorted in their views of China because they've never been there. Some of the reporters no doubt have been there, but just staying in hotels or not really understanding it, or even if they do go wandering around a bit, they are under heavy pressure from the West to portray China in certain ways. So the normal view of China in the West is still extremely prejudiced and often racist. And part of the work I've done with my colleague Zilan Wang is to try and set up various ways of creating a bridge of understanding between China and the West, particularly in Cambridge. My college has strong associations with great Chinese figures in the past, in particular Zhu Jimo, the famous 20th century Chinese poet, whose poem on saying goodbye to Cambridge again is learnt by every young Chinese, and I am the keeper of the Chinese stone in King's in his memory on the garden there. And we hold festivals and have set up a gallery and printing press and try to increase understanding, because unless civilizations now, which are clashing with each other, learn to understand something about each other, we are doomed as a species. We will just fight and squabble forever. So that is my goal, and this book on understanding the Chinese A to Z was one example of it. A second example attempt was when I wrote a book about 4 civilizations, one of which was China, another Japan. And in that I simplified China's essence down to certain characteristics. And the idea here was partly taken from Tocqueville, the idea that you can usually find keys that unlock a civilization, and they're not difficult. The difficulty is finding them, and once you've got them, they're easy to understand. He applied this to America and said, once you understand it's based on certain things, equality, liberty, individualism, then you will be able to understand a lot about America quite quickly. And I thought this would be impossible in China because it's such a big, diverse, ancient civilization. But gradually I realized the sort of counterintuitive thing which might have been said by Sherlock Holmes or Dupin. The difficulty about understanding China is that it's so simple, that its very ancient features, like its written language, like its bureaucratic, organized, top-down political system, like its family system, like its social structure. Many of these are actually, in essence, very, very simple. And I began to realize that if you're going to hold together over 1 billion people over a long time, you can't do it by making the organization complicated, because it'll fall to pieces as it spreads around. You have to keep it extremely simple, a few simple principles that extend over the whole area and hold it together. So in the last few years I've been refining my thoughts to bring them down to these simple principles. And what I've learnt about myself and my civilization is that these principles in China are totally diametrically different from my own. The family system is based on large male descendant groups, clans and lineages traditionally. The basic unit is the group rather than the individual. Thought is basically both and rather than either or. In other words, quantum thought rather than the binary thought of the West. There is no God, but there are many kinds of ritual and belief system jostling together. So its features are very, very different from anything I've been brought up in. And therefore, again, as with Japan, it was a civilization which enriched my own by showing the possibilities of so much different from my own. We are stifled within certain possibilities in our own society and civilization, and it's very liberating to expand the mind and see, as it were, thought experiments or science fiction, but in reality in different civilizations. So adding this case of China up, which is still an ongoing project because I've hardly scratched it so far, is another liberation. And it occurred just in the right time in my life when I was moving roughly towards retirement, aged 60 and a little over, with my last students, with the funds, the experience, the background, the status to do what I liked. And so throughout retirement I've been working on it, among other things. And so I rejoice in China as I rejoice in Japan, Nepal, and my own civilization and country, England.